This is a recording of a public lecture given at the University of Maine in Orono by history professor Liam Riordan. The 55-minute presentation provides an overview of the Maine statehood process, and suggests a framework for thinking about how the bicentennial of statehood can best be commemorated in 2019 and 2020. The recording starts with the end of remarks by Professor Richard Judd in the History Department at UMaine, who introduced Liam to the live audience for this lecture on February 5, 2018.
He has organized public forums and lectures and made over 15 presentations from Madawaska to Eastport and Waterville, drumming up interest in this rapidly approaching event. My guess is that we're going to hear a little more of this talk in his talk this afternoon, which is entitled What's So Funny About Commemoration? Past and Present Perspective on Maine Bicentennial. Please join me in welcoming Liam to the podium for this talk.
Well, thank you very much, Dick. I appreciate that introduction, and thanks also to Joel and other members of the symposium committee who put together this year's set of lectures and invited me to talk a bit about the coming bicentennial with you in today's talk. As Dick mentioned, I have been starting this work to try to focus some attention on the bicentennial and how should we go about recalling it, remembering it, commemorating, celebrating it, whatever it might be, in a series of public talks. And so this reflects the sort of fruits of that. Those started as sort of community conversations where I really didn't know much about Maine history in this era, and then gradually I've done research along the way, and so I'm here to talk a little bit about some of the past and present connections that we can see in thinking about the statehood process in the early 18th century and how that might help us to understand our present-day circumstances from a richer and more meaningful perspective. And I thought I would start today's version of the talk by calling a little bit of attention to commemoration itself. And this is a sort of odd aspect of history. I think a lot of academic historians are not really particularly comfortable with the idea of having a public role to play in helping the public to think about history and selecting from it what are the aspects of it that deserve our attention. And I think it's somewhat easier as we train in doctoral programs and go to conferences with other colleagues to really think narrowly about our scholarly specialty and to push the envelope of new knowledge and archival work and share with other specialists the fruits of what we're doing. But it strikes me that the oddity of something like a bicentennial, a round number that doesn't really have any significance except that we count things in tens and we give significance to hundreds. But this bicentennial moment provides a small opportunity to encourage the public to think a little bit more carefully about the distant past. So it'll come as a surprise to no one that an early American historian like myself is somewhat crestfallen as I take the measure of the historical consciousness of contemporary American society. It strikes me that we are not just obsessed with the present moment, but we're obsessed with the future. And what can technology help us do tomorrow, next week, next year, that's where so much of our excitement and energy in contemporary popular culture goes, that I hope something like a bicentennial can help us pause and reflect a bit and think about the distant past in a way that does help us think about the present, does help us think about the future, and to do so in a richer and more meaningful way. So I do think commemoration is a little funny. I do think it's a little strange. I don't think we are necessarily well equipped to think about what are the implications of commemoration and how best should we tackle it. But I want to take this opportunity, nevertheless, to talk a bit about the statehood process and what the bicentennial of Maine in 2019-2020 might offer to us as an opportunity. So I have one final introductory comment, and this really is apropos of last night's football game. I trained in Philadelphia as an early American historian, and really the central thrust of my graduate training was to push New England out of the center of how we think about early American history. So I wrote a first book about the Philadelphia region that really said, you know, we've been misled by thinking about New England as America writ large, and we're much better off to put our energy focusing on other places. So of course, I got a job in New England, particularly at a land-grant university. That means one should figure out a little bit about where you live and what the history of the era you study is. So as I began to get requests for local community talks, I decided, well, I better work up a talk about, does the Revolution look different from the Penobscot River? And in fact, it does. And so this bicentennial work is really the fruits of that 18 or 20 years down the road, as I've learned more and more about New England history and about Maine history more particularly. So let me start. I'll just point out this slide behind me. This is, I think it's safe to say, the only notable commemorative activity that has really gone forward thus far is a bicentennial license plate. So anyone who would like to support the state's Bicentennial Commission can buy this. It's actually a front plate that you're, I think, legally allowed to put on the front bumper of your car for the next 2 years. And then after that, you'll have to take it down and put back your boring old regular first plate. So what are the most basic things, the basic facts to start us thinking about Maine and the statehood process? So Maine became the 23rd state in the U.S. on March 15th, 1820. And this ended a long relationship that had begun in the 1650s with Massachusetts. So the District of Maine, or the Eastern Country, was part of Massachusetts for far over a century. And when Maine became the 23rd state, it was only the second state to be created from a pre-existing one. So Kentucky had split off from Virginia to become the 15th state in 1792, and there'd be only one other state to join this club, West Virginia, separated from Virginia during the Civil War to become the 35th state. So we're in a small club so far of sort of self-dividing states out of existing states. And the image I have up here is a map by Moses Greenleaf from 1820. And this is the first of at least 2 slides I'll share that are drawn from images at the Osher Map Library at the University of Southern Maine. As many of you know, the Osher Map Library is a sort of international caliber map archive, and they've done an extraordinary job of putting their collections online in high-resolution copies with all sorts of online exhibits. Not surprisingly, they have particular strengths in Maine maps and maps of the international border with Canada. And so Moses Greenleaf, as they describe him in the online exhibit, was Maine's greatest map maker and was certainly an important part of outlining and quantifying the state at its very origins in the 1820s. But where should we start our story today to best understand the process of Maine becoming a state? And clearly it has to be at some point prior to when this map was created in 1820. And I think when we're discussing the sovereignty of state authority in North America, surely one of the crucial contexts concerns the Native American presence and the persistence of Native societies and governments in the face of colonization. So it's important to begin by emphasizing, as this map from the Portland Press Herald in December 2014 illustrates, that the colonial presence of Massachusetts, the independent state of Maine in the early 19th century, and the provinces of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick and Quebec are all entangled with Native American land claims and their active presence throughout Wabanakia from the pre-colonial era up to the present. So my presentation today is organized around 4 significant connections that link the past of the Maine statehood process from some 200 years ago with issues that remain persistent in contemporary Maine. I think in all 4 cases, we will recognize aspects that are pressing concerns today, that seem like daunting concerns today, that are issues we're not sure how to resolve or address. And I hope for many of you, the realization that these were also pressing concerns 200 years ago might give us a better vantage point for understanding our contemporary moment and how we might respond to it more effectively. So the first of the 4 questions that structure my talk begins with, were there 2 Maines even before statehood? And the separation movement, that is the separation from Massachusetts movement, began with the founding of Maine's first newspaper, the Falmouth Gazette, in January 1785. It was largely founded on this single issue to try to press the District of Maine to separate from Massachusetts to become an independent body. Now, it pressed this issue pretty strongly through the late 1780s, but it ran afoul of Shays' Rebellion and was easily condemned as allied with the Shays' movement, and then with the development of the federal Constitution, that earliest energy for formal separation broke down. But it soon gained steam again. It might come as a surprise to no one who has lived in Maine a long time that there's long-standing resentment of distant Massachusetts authority. And by 1792, the first of 6 popular votes to separate from Massachusetts began. Now, one of the things that might give us some pause is, from our perspective today, it seems obvious and logical, perhaps natural and normal, that Maine would be independent from Massachusetts. So the fact that there are 6 votes, 1792 to 1819, seems like it took an awfully long time for these guys to get their act together and realize what, from our point of view, seems like should have been an easy decision to make. Isn't independence an obvious, a necessary, and a good goal? Well, of course, this is only the kind of perspective we can have in enormous historical retrospect. And I think if we reflect on Brexit or the growing sentiment for the European Union to dissolve, the recent controversy over Catalan independence from Spain, it's quite clear that these questions of creating a new sovereign entity are not easy matters to decide, and that they have all sorts of implications that give people pause and hesitation before progressing. So let's take a quick look at an overview map of the 6 Maine separation votes from 1792 to 1819. And I want to thank my colleague Patrick Womack in the Education School, who's a geography specialist. He put these maps together for me. And here we see green reflecting opposition to the independence movement, and purple representing support for the independence movement. So this is sort of large-scale county-level data, and of course the county boundaries may run all the way to the end of the state. That does not actually reflect where people lived in this era. But what the maps here help us to see is a big shift from 1807 to 1816, right? We still have significant opposition to independence in 1807, and by 1816, we have the first sizable presence of a strong vote in favor of independence. And of course, the crucial thing that comes in between here is the War of 1812. And during the War of 1812, as during the American Revolution, the British controlled large portions of the District of Maine. So during the War of 1812, the city of Castine, much of down East Maine, Eastport, even Belfast are controlled by the British, and the Federalist governor of Massachusetts did not expend any resources to mobilize a military force to try to push the British out. Now, this, in a lot of ways, is probably a very pragmatic and reasonable decision on the part of the Massachusetts governor, but you can imagine that people in the District of Maine were outraged by this lack of concern for people, particularly in far down East Maine. So that is part of the changing tempo in these separation votes until we get to the July 1819 vote, where every single county in the state had a majority vote in favor of independence. The closest vote was in down East Hancock County, where there was a 52% majority in favor of independence. Now, this sort of big look at the voting data for independence helps us see the largest patterns maybe, but we have to focus a little bit more to really understand in a more fine-grained way the way these independence votes reflected significant divisions within the voting population of Mainers in the early 19th century. So with my next slide, we're going to take a look at a detail from plate 20 of the Historical Atlas of Maine. And so two of the editors of the Historical Atlas are in the audience, so maybe they will help us to think more deeply about this and some of the other plates that we'll look at in just a minute. But the basic contrast that's shown in this detail is the difference between inland Kennebec County toward the top and coastal Lincoln County toward the bottom. And you can see in the two pie charts that the green represents votes in favor of separation and the red represents votes opposed to separation. So inland Kennebec County has an overwhelming majority in favor of independence for Maine. Coastal Lincoln County has a strong majority opposed to that same independence question. And then we can see all the little towns with their similar sort of bifurcated inland coastal voting patterns. Now, the crucial point about this is not just the geography of partisan voting, but that it maps onto a series of other social, religious, and political divisions in early Republican Maine society. So these coastal towns had much stronger ties to Massachusetts. Of course, land transportation is onerous and slow and downright impossible further you get into down East Maine. So it's really connections along the ocean and by shipping that are the most rapid and the strongest. So any place along the coast is going to have better connections to Massachusetts than interior places. Those coastal settlements had been settled by Euro-Americans for a much longer period of time than interior places. And those coastal places were also much more strongly Congregationalist in religion and more Federalist in their politics. And on each of these counts, we have a diametrically opposed profile for the population in inland places. These inland places were more newly settled. They had many more Baptists and Methodists. And these inland communities were the heart of the emerging Democratic Republican Party of the early 19th century. So Jeffersonian Republican partisanship is a crucial aspect of the voting patterns for statehood in Maine. And this is really led by a man by the name of William King, who was a wealthy merchant in Bath, often called the Sultan of Bath in literature on the 19th century. And King left the Federalist Party in 1803 to become the District of Maine's Democratic Republican leader. And by 1805, Democratic Republicans had a solid majority in the District of Maine, unlike in the flatland part of Massachusetts that retained strong Federalist strength into the 19th century. So we might think with that vote, that strong majority vote in July of 1819, that most of the issues of the sort of formal politics of Maine statehood are done. But there's one more crucial aspect of the statehood process in formal politics to consider, and that's the place of crafting a state constitution. So that vote met the standards required by the Massachusetts legislature for Maine to achieve statehood. And in October of 1819, a constitutional convention was held. 275 delegates attended from nearly every single one of the 236 incorporated towns in Massachusetts. Not surprisingly, they used the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780 as their model. They did not depart from it in an extreme way, but there are at least two interesting modifications that I think are worth further comment. And the first of these was, as so often in these Revolutionary era constitutions, it begins with a declaration of rights, right? What are the inalienable rights of the political citizens of this new sovereign state? And the Article 1 of the Declaration of Rights in the Maine Constitution included the absolute freedom of religion. Now, as I've already mentioned, a significant part of the Democratic Republican majority in Maine were dissenting Protestants. That is, they were non-congregationalists, and the Congregational Church is still a state-supported church in Massachusetts. So everybody's taxes go to support the Congregational Church, even if that was not your faith, and that'll be the case in Massachusetts until 1834. So it's no big surprise that Maine was going to throw that out, right? A big part of their desire for independence had to do with no longer being required to support the Congregational Church. But the commitment to religious fervor went even further than we might expect. One delegate to the Constitutional Convention explicitly stated that Catholics, Jews, and Muslims all should have freedom of worship, and that their testimony in court would be considered truthful, as would that of Hindus. So it's a kind of remarkable, open assertion of religious freedom and a respect for non-Christian religious traditions, much more encompassing than we might expect from Protestant New England. The delegates also received a petition from Catholics in Damariscotta. This is one of the few Catholic communities in Maine at the time that wasn't Indian or French. So these Irish Catholics petition the convention, and they say, we'd like to see in the Constitution a plank asserting that there is sort of Christian equality between Protestants and Catholics. Kind of interestingly, the delegates did not acknowledge this or discuss it. And I think that they might have recognized it as a potentially inflammatory subject that would lead them down a path that would, even if approved, would lead to some ugly sentiments being expressed, so they chose not to really consider that petition directly. Now, the second article in the Maine State Constitution takes up the matter of who had the right to vote. And the Maine Constitution of 1820 is quite clear that there will be universal male suffrage for those over 21 years of age with no property qualification to vote. And in fact, no delegate to the State Constitutional Convention even raised the issue of whether or not it would be a good idea to have a property qualification. And this stands in quite a bit of contrast with Massachusetts. They're going to be revising their constitution the following year, and there was a very strong debate that was defeated, but there was a strong group of conservatives in Massachusetts who felt that having a property requirement was a good and necessary thing for the health of the republic. Now, one delegate did raise the issue of whether free African Americans should be allowed to vote, and this was discussed, and it was decided that there should be no discrimination on the basis of African descent among the voters in the state of Maine. Now, free people of color in 1820 represented a little under 1% of the population. There's not any enslaved person in Maine in the census for 1820, so this is perhaps a more imaginary or principled sort of stand that didn't necessarily have intense local implications in the state. And in that sense stands in some contrast to the very clear prohibition on Native Americans who would not have the right to vote in state elections until well into the 20th century. So the proposed state constitution gets drafted by these delegates, it goes for a popular vote, and it is supported by 92% of the voters in December 1819. I don't think we could get a 92% vote for anything in the state of Maine today, so it suggests some strong degree of unanimity, and Maine became the 23rd state in March of 1820. Now, we might think that most questions of Maine statehood are essentially concluded by this point, right? They've had all their votes, they framed a constitution, it's been accepted, but this takes me to my second core question about thinking of the statehood process and how it might help us think more deeply about contemporary society. And this is the surprising question of slavery and Maine. Maine statehood was central to the first nationwide crisis about slavery and racial politics in United States history. The 16th U.S. Congress received a petition to admit Maine as a new state in December 1819, but this arrived at a very tricky political moment in the U.S. Congress. Earlier that year, back in February, the House had passed and the Senate had rejected an amendment from New York Congressman James Talmadge to block slavery as a legal institution in the proposed state of Missouri. So Missouri was a territory, part of the Louisiana Purchase. It also is applying for admission, and anti-slavery leaders in the House of Representatives decided that they should use the power of the federal government to prohibit the spread of slavery into the West and into Missouri in particular. So when the Maine petition arrived for statehood in the U.S. Congress, Maine representatives there warned William King, the sort of party leader back in Maine, of trouble. And so at this point, when I talk about Maine representatives, they're actually Massachusetts representatives, but there were 7 who lived in the District of Maine. So once statehood goes through, they're going to become Maine representatives, but in the course of the Missouri crisis, they represent the District of Maine in Massachusetts. So U.S. Congressman Mark Langdon Hill wrote to King from Washington in December 1819, warning that the Maine admission bill had been postponed and we think, quote, some bargain or compromise will be needed. He went on that all the Maine representatives mean to act prudently and, quote, say nothing opposed to the wishes of the Southern people. And he added a postscript to his letter, quote, I hope the people of Maine will remain still on the slave question. Now, William King wavered about what to do. His brother Rufus was a leading anti-slavery senator from New York. Right? His brother is leading the anti-slavery push in the U.S. Capitol. And we might expect King to follow his brother's anti-slavery stance. It seems that initially he thought about doing so. He was a little equivocal for a bit, but relatively quickly he fell in line with a minority of Maine political leaders in Washington, D.C., and decided that accepting slavery in Missouri was the best pragmatic route to Maine statehood. So the basic development over the national crisis over slavery occurs when the Senate links Maine and Missouri's admission to the Union, that they'll be considered together, that Missouri will be allowed to enact slavery as a legal institution if they like, but some kind of balance will be retained by it coming in with Maine, and some further balancing will be secured by prohibiting future slave states from territory to the north and to the west of the incoming Missouri territory. Now, the Speaker of the House, Henry Clay from Kentucky, really managed this difficult and explosive question in a very complex manner, and he managed to push through a series of bills that were all sort of interlinking to allow this Maine and Missouri compromise to go forward. It was an extremely hard-fought and difficult battle in the House of Representatives. It ends up passing by only 3 votes, and among those voters who favored admitting Missouri as a slave state, there were only 14 Northern congressmen who were prepared to accept that, and of the 14 were 2 of Maine's 7 congressional delegates. So if those 2 from Maine had pushed the other side, as the majority of their delegation did, it would have scuttled Missouri's admission to the Union as a slave state. Now, these 7 Maine delegates were subject to a great deal of political and popular pressure in the period. 6 of the 7 end up publishing open letters to their fellow citizens explaining their votes and the positions that they took. And we can see at this relatively early juncture the fundamental questions about the politics of slavery that are going to reemerge decades later as the United States enters civil war. Those who refused to allow slavery to expand explained simply that it was abhorrent to their notion of the rights of man and humanity, and that the idea of this was a compromise, was something that they, quote, utterly protested against and refused to sanction with their approbation. So this, even the calling it a compromise to these people who had been defeated felt like a mislabeling of the actual politics of the agreement that had emerged in this way. So these opponents published first. This led the other 2 to publish follow-ups later. And as in the sort of classic explanation of this, they justified their position as being consistent with the Constitution, as favoring compromise over civil war that would emerge if they pushed harder on this, and their desire to avoid a sharp sectional split. So this was part of the justification for this minority of Northern congressmen who voted with the slave interest to allow Missouri to enter the Union with slavery as a legal institution. Now, one of really the key Maine leader in favor of the compromise, so in favor of the expansion of slavery, was a politician from Alfred, Maine, named John Holmes. And he shared his public letter with his, in the newspapers that he sent to his constituents. He sent a copy to Thomas Jefferson. Right? He's an emerging Jeffersonian Republican politician. He wants to let Jefferson know what's going on and his good leadership to help forge this thing. And Jefferson wrote back to Holmes with the most famous political commentary on the Missouri crisis. It began with the famous line from Jefferson that, quote, "This momentous question, like a fire bell in the night, awakened and filled me with terror. I considered it at once the death knell of the Union." And here we have the letter itself is at the Library of Congress, fully digitized and transcribed on the Library of Congress's website. And what's, I think, particularly interesting about Jefferson's response is to look a little bit beyond that most famous line to really examine more about his assessment of this compromise, because it's a little bit darker than we might initially suspect. And Jefferson's fear is not that Missouri has come into the Union as a slave state. He thinks what's going to destroy the Union is that slavery has been prohibited in the territories beyond Missouri to the west and north. That by creating this geographical line, Lincoln says, a terrible civil war is going to come that will destroy the United States. And this is really consistent with Holmes's language as well. In Holmes's initial letter to his constituents, he explains that having slavery expand to Missouri is really a strategy for getting rid of slavery in the United States, that it is going to be made better by dispersing it, so you don't just have a small number of large slave plantations, that what you really want are small slave holdings all over the country, and over time slavery would wither away without the violence and destruction that abolitionists are calling for making it public issue and demanding a sort of moral standard as opposed to a practical one. So I want to close the talk about Maine and Missouri with two other observations about the kind of interesting fact of Maine and Missouri being linked in the way that they were. And one of these, so Missouri does enter the U.S. as the 24th state, so we're in as the 23rd in March of 1820. By August 1821, Missouri is in. And we're sort of in a habit today of thinking of Maine as a very small place with a very modest population. But in 1830, the population of Maine was the second largest population in New England, right? Second only to Massachusetts. So in the 1830 census, there are 400,000 residents in Maine. And in the 1830 census in Missouri, there are only 140,000 residents. So the relative demographic weight and position of these places is nearly the reverse of what it is in 2010. There also is, of course, a striking difference in the black population in each of these states, both in the past and in the present. The Maine black population in 1830 was well under 0.5%. The black population in Missouri was almost 20%. And then the second point I want to make about comparing Maine and Missouri, I earlier said some relatively positive things about the Maine state constitution, that it's openness in religion and its lack of a property test for voting represent strengths of the Maine Constitution. And I think if we compare the Maine Constitution with the Missouri one, it gives us more room to think that Maine crafted a more impressive document. Missouri's state constitution caused yet more controversy, since it not only prohibited the state from ending slavery in its future, it also prohibited free African Americans from settling there. And many in Congress pointed out that this violated the Constitution, which you cannot take away the rights that citizens have in other states with state laws. But again, Henry Clay sort of manipulated the situation with a congressional act that was a second Missouri Compromise to make sure that Missouri statehood didn't get derailed by reactions to this punitive and pretty reprehensible state constitution. Now let's move to a third core question, and that is where to draw the border. And this, as Maine becomes a state, reignites the point that we really don't know where the northern border of the state of Maine lies and where the division is with British North America. So this goes back to the treaty negotiations at the end of the American Revolution. Again, the Osher Map Library has a really wonderful online exhibit about this particular Mitchell map that they own a copy of, and the crucial ways that it was used by negotiators at the Treaty of Paris in 1782 and 1783 to try to decide where should the international boundary line be drawn. Now, this debate remained unsettled for decades after 1783. We had that map of Maine we saw earlier, but again, the sort of northern reaches of the state are not really being mapped in 1820. And a lot of this the sort of core of it gets sorted out from 1821 through the Webster-Ashburton Treaty of 1842. So here we have another detail from the Historical Atlas of Maine that traces these competing claims about where the language in the Treaty of 1783 actually fit on the ground in trying to assess where should these proper boundaries be. Now, one of the most interesting places where I had a discussion about how do we commemorate the bicentennial and what's the meaning of Maine statehood was in Madawaska. And when I met there with a group in the Madawaska High School library, I learned about, I think, a widespread phrase up there. And many, many people thanked me for coming to Madawaska because they said they understood that because it was uphill to drive to Madawaska, it was very difficult for people from southern Maine, like Bangor and Orono, to get all the way to Madawaska. And the more pressing aspect, though, of this meeting was the still quite palpable pain that people in Madawaska feel with the drawing of the international border along a river that divided their French-speaking community. And so particularly with increased border security in the wake of September 11th, the border challenges are more pressing and more painfully felt now than they were 20 or 30 years ago. So in some sense, the border is quote-unquote settled by the 1842 negotiations between the U.S. and Britain, but in many other ways, that international uncertainty and the local turmoil of how that line gets drawn remains extremely pressing. Now let me turn to my fourth and final core question that I think continues to link the past of Maine statehood with the present of Maine life today, is to ask what Maine statehood means for Wabanaki sovereignty. What were the consequences of a new state being created out of Massachusetts for Native Americans in this region? And this sort of well-known painting of a Passamaquoddy woman during the War of 1812 very nicely pulls together some of these themes. In the window behind her, we can see perhaps a Yankee militiaman or even possibly a U.S. soldier on one side and a British redcoat in the other. But here foregrounded for us is the question of this Passamaquoddy woman and what this conflict will mean. So the Penobscot and the Passamaquoddy have a truly remarkable status in the U.S., and this is a sort of, as someone who trained as an early American historian, it's sort of amazing to me that I did not really know this until many years after living in Maine, but that these two, the Penobscot and the Passamaquoddy, are perhaps the only two Native American groups in the United States east of the Mississippi River to have retained a continuous, unbroken claim on some part of their pre-colonial homeland down to the present day. This is really a remarkable demonstration of their persistence and continuity in the face of colonization. Now, there's no question that the Maine statehood era represents a period of enormous challenge and threat to the Penobscot and the Passamaquoddy. And I think this is well illustrated by yet another plate in the Historical Atlas of Maine with yet another author in the audience, or co-author. And here we've got three maps showing the decreasing land claim of the Penobscots in various treaties with Massachusetts from 75 to 1796 to 1818. So there's no question that the early 19th century represents a time of grave challenge for Wabanaki people in this region. And the Penobscot and the Passamaquoddy have a somewhat different treaty experience, and so they're not entirely equivalent, so we have to pay some attention to them as experiencing distinct responses to what Maine statehood meant. But one of the other really quite remarkable things about Maine Indian politics in the statehood era concerns the fact that first the Penobscot and then the Passamaquoddy, and quite a bit later the Holton Band of Maliseets, have tribal representation at the Maine legislature beginning in 1820. Now, these are non-voting positions, so it's not as if they are full legislative members, but they were formally acknowledged to have a seat, to have rights to speak. These would actually be repealed for a time in the 1940s when they were demoted to just being observers, but that position has maintained up until 2015, when the Penobscot and the Passamaquoddy, in response to being treated poorly by the governor's office, decided they no longer wanted to have even these non-voting seats in the legislature. So this remains a strong continuity and point of conflict from the beginning of the statehood era up to the present. Maine is distinctive as being the only state in the U.S. to have tribal representatives in its state legislature, of course, but also was the only state that asserted state oversight over sizable reservation populations. Right? No other state had that. Everywhere else, it was a federal authority and a federal relationship with Indians, and that is only challenged with a court case in 1975. And the final point I want to discuss about Wabanaki political rights concerns the right to vote. And as is probably well known, Native Americans do not have the right to vote in federal elections until 1924, itself a fairly shocking date. But the franchise for Indians in state elections is even much later than that. And so the state legislature passes Native voting rights in local, county, and state elections only in 1953. And then the actual implementation of that is a whole nother question, right? Just because you've got the right to vote on the books, what happens when you try to register with a local person who may or may not be sympathetic with your desire to be registered to vote? And for some Wabanaki people, the right to vote was itself a complicated question. Did that mean, for a lot of Wabanaki people, getting the right to vote in Maine elections was another sign of an attack on tribal government? If you were going to vote in state elections, what did that mean about your relationship to tribal politics? For other Wabanaki people, they wondered, will this jeopardize our tax-exempt status if we're now voting? So the divisions and complications of this are quite rich. That notwithstanding, here we have a sort of iconic photograph of Lucy Nicola, a major political activist and Penobscot performer, supposedly casting the first vote in a state election in 1954 or 1955. It appears in the Bangor Daily News in 1955. So with that, I want to wrap up and hopefully get some questions and suggestions of ways I could revise or modify the talk. The State Bicentennial is coming up in 2019 and 2020, and we still have lots of planning and thinking to do to figure out how best to encourage the broad Maine public to think more deeply and more concretely about the implications of our deep history for how we understand ourselves in the present and in the future. So, thank you all very much. I appreciate you coming today.